So could we start with just getting for the sake of this, getting an idea of who you are with perhaps your name, date of birth, and where you come from as well?
Yeah, well, my name is Geoff Christian. My family are very much Manx. We've been living on the same farm in the north of the island, Balakai, certainly since the manorial period. Manorial roll dated 1515. My family have been continuously, generation upon generation, right up to now, living at Balakai in Bride. So we have a long connection with the island. Yeah, I've sort of grown to appreciate my Manx roots more in recent years. Originally I worked and trained with Martin's Bank, which is a bank, had its head office in Liverpool in Water Street. I started work with them in Ramsey and Parliament Street, in 52 Parliament Street. I did my first sort of younger training with them, and then Barclays Bank bought them out. And I spent the rest of my working life with Barclays Bank. A short time with Nationwide International. But in a way I feel grateful that I was able to spend my working life on the island. A lot of local lads and lasses were sort of tempted away to the UK for a number of years to develop their career, but I managed to spend 44 years working on the island, which I'm grateful for, really. I didn't have a burning desire to go out and set the world on fire anywhere else, so yeah, and I've been retired about 10 years now. So you asked what my birth date was. Birthday, I was born on the 10th of May in 1943.
And so, in Bride, growing up in Bride, I guess you would have been, it was Bride?
Yes, yeah.
I guess you would have been eventually at the Ramsey Grammar.
I was. I went to Bride. I initially started at Bride School. At that time, I started, it'd be 1948. I started in Bride School, and they took children there up to the age of 11, and then I think they went to Ramsey Grammar School. But after I'd been about a couple of years at Bride School, they changed the system, and actually when I was 8, I went to Albert Road School and went there for 3 years, and then on to Ramsey Grammar. And I stayed at Ramsey Grammar and took my GCEs there. And then I was very fortunate, I think, on reflection, I got a job in Martin's Bank. And I stayed with them as long as I could, and then with Barclays.
And so that would be about the same time as you joined the choir?
I joined the choir probably around about 1958. My father was also a member, my aunt was the conductor, and I remained a member right up to when we ceased, the choir ceased around about in the 1990s, so I was quite a long time member. All the members were pretty well local guys, living around the north of the island, and we had a good time, really. We used to give concerts here and there to old folks' homes, perhaps raise a concert to raise money for a local church or something like that. And it was during that time that Kathleen sort of started a connection with the choir, and I think, as I mentioned before, I think she enjoyed the friendship and the opportunity to also just to read her own work. I think she wasn't sort of an ebullient character who sort of pushed whatever she composed. And I think she enjoyed just the friendship of the guys in the choir, and, as I say, the opportunity to read her own work or recite her own work. And I feel sort of, looking back, I didn't really appreciate at the time, but with the passage of time, I think I do appreciate the fact that I was quite lucky to hear her doing reciting her own work, really. And we had sort of she had an association with the choir, I suppose, around about 10 years. She was not a great conversationalist or anything like that. She's very quiet, reserved, very private person, I think. But I always had this feeling that she had this sort of incisive, sort of keen, inquiring interest in what people were saying and what people were doing, and their sort of various idiosyncrasies, and I think she liked to poke a little bit of gentle fun at them under a sort of pseudonym, but she had a sort of quite a humorous, sort of incisive, inquiring and observant way, really. She was very aware of what was going on round about her, although she wasn't particularly, as I say, a great conversationalist or anything like that. But
and so, what sorts of situations? In what situations was she performing with you?
She would perform at our. We held an annual dinner, usually around about January, February every year, and it was a very formal affair. We invited, say, Sidney Bolton, the editor of the Ramsey Courier, who was very interested in the choir and supportive of the choir, and we generally asked him to do a speech replying on behalf of our guests, and we also had some of our members would do solos as entertainment during the dinner or after the dinner normally. No, we went to the Mitre Hotel in Parliament Street. Various times we went to the Prince of Wales Hotel on the South Prom, and we also used the Queen's Hotel. I think now there's only the Mitre Hotel left, but and we also had some of our annual dinners at the Grand Island Hotel. As I say, it was a very sort of formal chairman and members, and a very formalised dinner, and in addition to the people we had for entertainment, over roughly about a 10-year period, we invited Kathleen to do a couple of spots, which she really enjoyed. And I think, all right, she had a captive audience in some respects, because there was generally the members of the choir plus their partners or their wives. And after a decent meal and a few drinks, the company was very convivial and relaxed. And as I say, she had a captive audience there, and I think that the lads really appreciated what she did. And it was something a little different away from the singing, say the choral singing or even the solo singing. And if we did a concert, it was a nice contrast for the audience to have her recite her own work. As I say, the guys in the choir enjoyed, male voice choir, and we had a lady, my aunt, who conducted, and we had a performer in the shape of Kathleen as well, doing Manx Dialect at a time when I think Manx Dialect poems and so on was starting to decline. There's a big influx of people into the island, I guess, in the 50s. A lot of the people from the what was left of the empire, if you like, the British Empire, as it sort of finally crumbled, they came home from the colonies and places like Africa, and which affected, it sort of diluted to some extent, if you like, the Manxness of the community. The sort of balance changed a bit. And then I started work in 1961 in Ramsey. We had quite a big influx of people from the UK and further afield, but predominantly at that time I think people were coming to the island because of the low taxation regime we had here. And of course that sort of further diluted or changed the balance, if you like, of the local Manx community. And I think there weren't, at that time, there weren't that many people composing poems in the Manx dialect. There were people like Dolan Kelly, who Elaine mentioned, but Dolan was always very interested, I thought, in T.E. Brown. He had it was his sort of subject in a way, and I know he at times he used to recite T.E. Brown, and I know he memorised a considerable amount of T.E. Brown's work, and was Dolan was quite a performer in his own right, whereas Kathleen was a quieter personality, and she wasn't ebullient or anything like that, but I think she loved the opportunity just to perform her own work.
So she, as well as the Christmas dinner, she was also semi-regular performer.
Yes. Particularly we used to entertain some of the old folks. Quails Hall, which is still in Ramsey. It's not one of the halls that hasn't been knocked down just yet. We would do there. We would do a concert from time to time for elderly people, for pensioners, and that was an ideal audience for her because they could relate to. A lot of them could very much relate to the Manx dialect, which is the type of poem she wrote. She composed, and maybe she might have been the last of the really Manx dialect poets. I'm not sure. I can't think of anybody composing at the present time, in 2015, composing poems in the Manx dialect. And I think maybe it's a generational thing now with, myself and Elaine have got a couple of grandchildren. They're not very interested in things like Manx dialect, or they're interested in their iPads and stuff like that, which maybe is a little bit of impetus for your work, really, because the community is changing. It's in the last 30 years, the change has just been phenomenal. And of course, we've not been immune in the island from all that change either, and never will be, I don't think. It's I can go back when in the late 1940s. It was quite usual for. We had radio at that time. We had wireless, but in the late 40s, we used to have quite a regular concert in the local, either the church hall in Bride or the school hall, where people would just turn up, perhaps engage a local choir, maybe Ramsey Male Voice Choir, but there's another choir in Ramsey called the Cushigs Choir. Cushigs Choir is still going. They'd perhaps invite the choir along, and they would bring along a few solo performers, and they'd do sketches and solos and choir pieces, and they'd probably have a Manx dialect, somebody reciting Manx dialect as well. And to some extent that's been lost, now. We watch our television rather than going down to the church hall and watching people basically producing their own entertainment.
Yeah. So what do you know of how Kathleen came to be associated with the Male Voice Choir?
I think, I'm not precisely sure, but I think it was my aunt who knew her from somewhere. I'm not sure how she made contact, but I know my aunt used to like to include her in our programme because it just gave it that bit of variety, and it was not. I don't think there were any other choirs at that time who could produce somebody with doing Manx dialect poems, quite honestly.
And so you were actually almost a double act, the Male Voice Choir and Kathleen?
Yes. Well, she was part of our programme.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And so who was your aunt?
My aunt was Emily Margaret Christian, LRAM. She does appear in Manx Worthies. She went off Ireland to train in London, and she got her LRAM and came back to the island. She taught for many years pianoforte. She didn't actually teach me pianoforte, but I wasn't very interested. And she was well known across the island, particularly with the Manx Music Festival, the Guild. She was an official accompanist there for many years, and a member of the committee for the Guild.
And so she was a Ramsey person?
Well, she was Bride, really. My family comes from Bride. Yeah. She was born in Bride, and as I was, I've got two brothers and a sister. We were all born at home on the farm. Emily was born in Bride, and as I say, she trained in London and came back to the island and spent all her life. She was a single lady. She never got married, but she was very involved in music on the island. She taught music, and she was very involved in the Guild.
You said something about where you performed, but where did you practice? We
practiced in Waterloo Road Methodist Church. We practiced there during all the time I was with the choir. We practiced. There's a sort of a back room there. We had the room to ourselves, and we kept our music there. We had a cupboard to ourselves, and it was a convenient, sort of fairly central place. That not all the membership came from the town of Ramsey. They came from Kirkmichael, came from Bride, Andreas, Laxey, and at one point there were one or two coming down from Douglas as well. When I moved to Douglas in 1972 to live, and from that time on up to about in the 1990s, I travelled down from Douglas.
And so, I think your wife mentioned perhaps that you once gave Kathleen Faragher a lift.
We used to give her a lift occasionally, pick her up, but generally she seemed to get herself into town. She was living out at Meckle. She'd probably get a bus in, I think, most time. Sometimes some of the guys would perhaps pick her up in Meckle on the way down to the choir. But, I think she must have travelled mostly by bus, I think. To my knowledge, I don't think she drove a car or anything like that.
All right, so you don't really remember. You didn't really visit her as such, or have conversations with her.
No. My only contact was at the choir, and if we were out at a concert or something like that, or perhaps our annual dinner. I heard her perform, I guess, many times really. But as I say, she was a very reserved, quiet personality, and I never really ever had a conversation with her in the time that she involved herself with the choir.
I'm intrigued to know who was, just trying to understand, because I would imagine that today a lot of choirs are aging rapidly. But I imagine back in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't for more elderly gentlemen. I imagine it was.
They were, when I joined around about 1958. Most of the guys would be most of the members of the choir at that time were probably aged 40ish, 50, sort of. I would think middle-aged. The present time I belong to a local choir in Douglas here, Londu Choir. The average age is quite high. I suppose the average age is probably about 75, I would think. But I mean, there are choirs on the island at the moment who the average age is much younger. There are quite a lot of smallish choirs and groups that the average age is a lot lower. Elaine has a choir, an SATB choir. Actually, the average age of that is quite high, but we've only been going for about 4 or 5 years. But at the time that Kathleen was involved with the Ramsey Male Voice Choir, the average age I would think were probably the choir members. I joined when I was about in my late teens, but most of the choir members at that time would be, I would think, they would be middle-aged, I guess.
It seems like a strange combination of practicing in a church and singing English style material, Englishy material, and then having Kathleen as the most. Yeah,
well, of course, we did things like within our repertoire, we had Ellen Vannin. It was a pretty obvious one to have, the Manx national anthem. We had another piece called the Battle of Santwat, which I think Santwat was somehow associated with Santon. It was a battle apparently historically between the people in the north of the island and the south, and it's reputedly when the women from the north waded in with the men from the north, they won the battle apparently. And there's a song written, I think it's in the Manx National Songbook, called the Battle of Santwat. And there was this 4-part harmony we performed that quite regularly actually. And there were other sort of Manx songs from time to time, but predominantly I suppose they were within the choir. They were more, I suppose you'd describe it as the usual sort of male voice repertoire. You'd probably find a lot of it in a male voice choir in the UK. But as I say, we used to enjoy having Kathleen sort of with us because of it just added variety to our programme. It wasn't all choir or sort of all choral singing. It wasn't all solo singing. We were able to put Kathleen on and to do the Manx Dialect poem, and it just added a bit of variety and interest, I think, to what we did.
And do you remember? You don't remember any of the actual poems she read?
I can't remember any of them. I'm sorry, I just can't. I think you mentioned Cushing. Was it Cushing or Fuchsia? Was that a small booklet that was produced at one point?
Fuchsia,
I think I've come across that somewhere, but I can't honestly remember anything particularly that stood out. As I say, at the time, I don't think I really appreciated fully what I was listening to, in a way.
And did the others? Was there besides the interest in the variety? Was there an awareness of her as something, as it were?
I think so. I think certainly. I think among the choir members there was a realization actually that she had something to say, and the fact that she was continuing a tradition really of Manx dialect poetry, and I think to some extent when the members of the choir at that time were closer to, if you like, Kathleen's generation. And I think they did appreciate the fact that she was something special really in her own right, and perhaps we were witnessing one of the last of the real Manx dialect poets really. I didn't realise it at the time certainly, but looking back. I think the choir members did appreciate, and I think she appreciated the company as well, and the opportunity just to recite her own work.
I think you're the first person I've spoken to who really remembers her speaking. No one else. Remembers her reciting.
There'll be a few people around. There's not many members of the Ramsey Male Voice Choir left now, actually, but. There won't be many people around now, I don't think, who would have heard her, actually. In a way, it was a generational thing. She would be getting on in years when she was associated with the choir. It's difficult to...
And I guess she was entertaining, as you say, an ageing
yes.
audience.
But she had a gift in a way. She could hold her audience, and when the audience, she didn't let the audience stray. When she was performing her work, I always felt she sort of almost had a grip on the audience in a way. It was her own work, and she was able to sort of put it across as she wanted, and. As I think I mentioned before, I've heard other people recite her work, but it's nowhere near as interesting or as exciting, really, as hearing her do it herself, really. Looking back.
But one other thing we haven't spoken about was the mention of Kathleen Faragher's teasing of members of the choir with her poems. If that's the right word.
Well, I always felt she had this sort of quite incisive sort of an observation of what people were doing and saying, and she used to pick that up in her poems, I think, and she'd make some of the characterisation, I think, would be based on some of her observations, which I suppose is not surprising really, but although she had, as I mentioned before, she was a very quiet personality, I always felt she was quietly very alert to what was going on round about her, and observational of people's idiosyncrasies and habits and what they said and so on. And I think she liked to include some of that in her poetry, probably under the disguise of another name, possibly. But
do you know of anyone who appeared in her poetry?
No, not directly. No, but she definitely had this ability to sort of take on board people's sort of character and some of the things they said, I think, from time to time.
And did no one ever complain about that? Because her poems are so...
No, I think she was careful to... I never ever heard of anybody complaining, but I think she was very careful to disguise just exactly who she was referring to, shall we say. But it was a sort of gentle sort of, it wasn't sort of bitter or at all. It was a sort of a gentle teasing sort of observation of people. And I think she liked to take out the sort of humorous and sort of amusing sort of side of people. I think, which I think probably enhanced her poetry actually. Yeah.
And so, did she perform just in everyday clothes, or did
she just turned up well dressed for our annual dinner, smartly dressed, but she never dressed up in costume for anything in my memory. It was always just herself, and with no frills or anything like that.
And you weren't fearful of her to used to speak about her observations? You didn't?
No. She wasn't a frightening personality by any means. But as I say, she was just sort of quietly there in the company in a way, and she wasn't a great conversationalist in my. I don't remember her as being a great conversationalist. But as I say, I always felt she was alert to what was going on in company and so
on. Great. And a very specific question. I know that she did early on, in about 1954 or thereabouts, a man named Sidney Marshall made a record of her. He was in the Manx Society in Manchester, and he set her poems to music. And he later moved back to Ramsey.
I remember the name, Marshall. Definitely, he was a member of the Ramsey Male Voice Choir. And I think it was Sydney.
He was a Ramsey man, and he also was a part of the Gramophone Club.
I don't know about that. But definitely, if it's the same guy, and I guess it is, he was very interested in the choir. I'm not aware that he sort of recorded or anything or had any particular connection with Kathleen, but it's quite likely he was very interested in the choir, and he was a member he retired, so far as I'm aware, to the island, lived in Ramsey, and he was very interested in what the choir did. It's quite likely that he may have recorded something that Kathleen may have done. I mean, I think it's easy to sort of say that the Manx dialect was of no interest to sort of people, perhaps a new resident, but I think some of the new residents, and maybe Mr. Marshall, although it was in Manx dialect and they perhaps had no particular connection with the island, or a relatively short connection with the island, I think they did appreciate some of her work. But I'm not aware that there was ever any recording done. I think Mr. Marshall had a daughter who continued to live on the island, but I think she must be deceased by now, surely. But it sort of rings a bell. The name Marshall certainly rings a bell.
I was hoping that I'd strike a chord and you would say,
yeah.
I know where the record is.
No, I've no idea. I've no recollection at all that he recorded any of her work.
And he also didn't bring to the choir, therefore, because he composed, he didn't bring any of his music.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. That's really great. So do you have, or how do you rate Kathleen Faragher?
It's difficult to say, really. I think she was very much a sort of an individual sort of composer. It's difficult to compare her with anybody else. I don't think she's quite in the same league as T.E. Brown, but I think probably in some respects, she was a bit closer to, if you like, this indigenous Manx part of the population in the north of the island than probably T.E. Brown was, and I think probably her poetry was a bit closer to, if you like, the men in the street than perhaps T.E. Brown's work. But certainly, I think as a composer of Manx dialect poems, I think she she deserves to be remembered, certainly. I think there's a real danger, even now as we speak, that probably most of what she's done, or a large part of what she did, may possibly have been lost. I don't know.
Yeah, I think doing this should be very good in that one day, perhaps when we have to wait the 70 years for her work to go out of copyright,
yeah,
and it's republished, I think people will rediscover her importance, and then at least we've got all these records of these memories of who she was.
When I've not been aware. Obviously I know she was a poet within her own right, but I hadn't realised she'd written various stories at all.
Her last one was published. She was publishing weekly, and the last one was published on the day she died, 10th of May, 1974. And I know in one of the newspaper reports they say that she was preparing a new book. I assume that was the storybook about to come out, but it never came, and so I think we've just forgotten that she did so much of that. And they're great stories, unlike the poems, which are very much kind of dialect bits of fun about the lady going to the choir practice. Stories are often about children living in Ramsey, and so she's obviously returning to her own childhood. Talking about falling in the Morag Park and things like this, and they're very, very kind of moving stories.
Yeah, well, I think the poetry probably reflects the local community in a way. I mean, she would remember probably in her childhood a lot of people with very much a Manx dialect sort of every day. And I guess in her own right she will have captured a short space of sort of an interesting time in a way, because I think that, as I mentioned before, the community now is changing with sort of modern telecommunication, iPads and computers, and there's a real danger that a lot of stuff like Kathleen did, just through lack of interest or lack of knowledge, it's going to get lost if we're not careful.
It's also an opportunity, of course, because like what she was doing to older people in church halls can be done now, over an iPad. And it's just a matter of finding a way to do it. We'll get there, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, myself and Elaine, we've always been interested in the Guild, the Manx Music Festival, and they used to always have a class in there for Manx dialect, but I think that's getting smaller. There aren't so many people. In fact, there aren't so many people really who could teach, sort of, if you like, Manx dialect. Our daughter, who is a teacher, and she's head at Andrea School. When she was young, she went to a lady close by here for Manx dialect poetry, and she entered in the Guild. But there just aren't that many people who have a clear idea of the Manx dialect left anymore. It's just the sort of pace of change, I suppose, in the last 30, 40 years. It's I mean, when I was born in 1943, and it was about 1952 before we actually had a telephone in the farmhouse. There was a telephone kiosk in the village. If you wanted to make a telephone call, you legged it, across the fields to the village and made your telephone call. And these days, just the youngsters now, they've got their little iPhone stuck in their back pocket. It's a completely different world, and I think television and radio are sort of, because of that, we're getting a very, if you like, a very English sort of everyday way of talking. The old dialects are dying, unfortunately. And it's not just the Manx dialect. I think in dialects, say, in Scotland and north of England, which were pronounced at one time, they're just dying out. When I went to school, one of the teachers at Ramsey Grammar School, I can't remember his first name, but his surname was Collister. He reckoned that in his youth he could recognise there was a different dialect between Ramsey, Douglas, Castletown and Peel, and he reckoned if somebody came through the door and he was from Peel, if he heard him talking for 2 or 3 minutes, he could recognise the dialect. Maybe it was an emphasis on certain words, but he reckoned he could recognise you know, if I walked into the room, I'd come from Ramsey or whatever, in the north, he could recognise the area of the island I'd come from. So I think, and actually at the time I sort of had a rather bit of disbelief, but I think he probably could actually sort of recognise a difference in the dialect. And I guess if you go to the north of England and what have you, the more remote areas, some of the dialect is still there, but gradually I think it's going to disappear. And it's a shame. It's a shame that future generations just probably won't appreciate their dialect at all.